Today, I will be analysing the importance that gender plays in relation to wealth and how they both can be affected due to how developed one's country or culture is. To begin, definitions of the key terms will be provided. Firstly, throughout this seminar, I will be discussing the terms OECD and non-OECD countries. It is important that we know and understand these terms before I go on. Firstly, OECD stands for Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. It is a multidisciplinary international body made up of 30 countries who work and consult with one another in order to develop and refine economic and social policies. It includes countries such as Australia, France, Japan, and the United States, just to name a few. OECD countries have quite stable economies and are known to have a high Human Development Index number. A non-OECD country is the complete opposite to an OECD country. They do not have high economies and are known to be rather unstable, as well as having a low Human Development Index number. Afghanistan, Iraq, and Thailand are just a few countries which are labelled under non-OECD countries. The other two key terms which will be mentioned throughout this seminar include gender and wealth. According to Oxford Dictionary, gender is simply the state of being either male or female, whilst wealth can be defined as a measure of the value of all assets of worth owned by a person, community, company, or country. These two variables interact with each other in many ways, as gender inequality in relation to income is quite a major problem in all parts of modern society. Gender inequality refers to the unequal treatment or perceptions of individuals based on their gender, which is usually women, and exists in all areas such as the workplace, home, and one's country or culture. It is the result of persistent discrimination based upon someone's gender, and it manifests itself due to race, culture, politics, countries, and economic situation. In the workplace, gender inequality is present when wage discrimination exists, and it has been understood that wage discrimination has favoured men over similarly qualified women. This has been noted by Maya Yesh, who discovered that countries with high levels of women's concentration in the public sector had a bigger gender gap in job authority. Whilst gender inequality can occur to either male or female in individual situations, it predominantly occurs to females, and extreme consequences can be relevant in many OECD countries. For example, in Afghanistan, young women can have acid thrown into their faces for attending school, which is an extreme case of gender inequality in modern society. Gender inequality and discrimination is believed to cause poverty and vulnerability to particular societies. As this occurs in OECD countries, it is mainly predominant in non-OECD countries. This leads me to the hypothesis of women in non-OECD countries have a less desire to study or work, as well as seeking employment. To investigate the hypothesis, data was used from the World Value Survey and constructed and analysed in SPSS to uncover particular statistics, which can be used to confirm the hypothesis of women in non-OECD countries have a less desire to study or work, as well as seeking employment. Firstly, it was important to find how many people who took part in the survey, and how important they believe work was. The first graph which I am presenting in this seminar asks how important work was to the person. This is a univariate analysis which displays a comparison between the four nominal values which were asked in this question. The variables in this question include not at all important, not very important, rather important, and very important. By looking at this graph, we can see that not everyone took part in this question, as 1.5% of people did not take part in it. This is highlighted in red. 2.5% of participants in this survey believed work to be not at all important, while 5.9% believed it to be not very important, 27.2% rather important, and 62.8% to be very important. This data is highlighted in green. The most relevant measure of central tendency for this graph would be the mode, because we are dealing with nominal values. This graph is the first part in investigating the hypothesis, as it shows how important work is to people in both OECD and non-OECD countries. Cross-tabulation is a quantitative research method, which is extremely appropriate for analysing the relationship between two or more variables. It provides a simple comparison of the results of one variable with the results of another. The next step in analysing to see if the hypothesis is correct is using SPSS to do a cross-tabulation of graph 1, with adding the variable of gender. By looking at graph 2, you can see the added variable of sex, which can be highlighted in red, which can be seen highlighted in red. Two important pieces of information which I noticed in this cross tabulation is the difference in male and female who think that work is very important, as well as not at all important. 67.7% of males found work to be very important, which is 7.5% higher than women at 60.2%. This supports the hypothesis, as it proves that women find work to be less important, which could be due to the fear of gender inequality. This information not only tells us that men think that work is more important than women, but also that more women find work to be not at all important. 2.1% of men who undertook the survey answered the question with not at all important, compared to the 3% of women. This supports the hypothesis as well. These important discrepancies in the data can be seen in the graph in green. The next graph which I have constructed in the analysis is similar to graph 2. However, I have replaced the variable gender with the split OECD. This new variable is shown highlighted in red. The most important piece of information generated from this graph is the percentage of both OECD and non-OECD people who took part in the survey. That found work to be more important. 66.2% of the non-OECD people answered this question with very important, which is higher than the OECD people who had 50.3% of people. This can be seen in the graph in the green text. This could be due to the non-OECD people living in more difficult economic circumstances and rely on money more so than people living in more developing countries. In saying this, people in the non-OECD countries also answered the not at all important part of the question at 2.2%, which is significantly lower than people in the OECD countries at 4.5%. This can be seen in the blue text. This proves that obtaining work in non-OECD countries could be much harder, which means women would have a much harder time in obtaining employment, as most men will be dominating the workplace. The next cross-tabulation compares two different variables, which are sex and are you the chief wage earner in your house. The cells in this table show both the frequency and the percentage of the chief wage earners for each gender. By looking in the total column, which is highlighted in red, we can see that the gender of the people, as well as the amount of the people who took this survey, is quite even. Furthermore, it is evident from analysing this graph that men are usually the chief wage earners in both OECD and non-OECD countries, with roughly 70% of men answering yes to this question. This means that 2/3 of men are usually the chief wage earner, with only 1/3 of women. This shows the gender inequality in relation to work in the world that we live in today. To determine if we can generalize these results to the whole population, a chi-square test must be constructed for significance. By looking at this graph, it can be seen that the Pearson chi-square is a high value due to the size of the sample and the numbers of the category used. However, by looking at the symmetric measures, that the value is less than 0.05, which is why we can generalize that this relation to the population as a whole. It can be concluded that the data from the surveyed population for the World Values Survey tends to support the hypothesis of women in non-OECD countries have a less desire to study or work, as well as seeking employment. This can be seen due to the graphs which have been presented throughout the seminar, as well as the data taken and constructed from these graphs.